Okay. We got a few questions that's going to get us started off this with this panel discussion and question and answer here online. So the first question, mag chloride use on county roads break down and blow into fields. Any concerns with how this may affect the soils that those are blowing into?
Yeah, that's a mag source. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Probably, I don't know how much wind y'all have, but how far can that go? A long ways.
Well, most of it gets to Nebraska, so we're okay, I think. But yeah, no, we get a lot of wind, especially in certain areas in that. So yeah, it would be an impact. Let's see here. Can you talk to address crop rotation current practices on dry land and irrigated crops that to change microbiomes? Let me say it again. Can you address crop rotations that are current practices on dry land and irrigated crops to changes in the microbiome?
Well, my big answer is cereal crops. If you have an opportunity, do fantastic in building soil health. So that's one of the rotations that you can look at. But I liked how Rory said that what the barley worked great for cover crops, but after barley, and in your system, just look for opportunities where you could fit in something, knowing that you can't do it after every crop or before every crop, but there are probably opportunities there that you can take advantage of. And that's what you all are a lot more clever about this stuff than we are. All of you all thinking and how it fits to your system. I would go with that it could be a cash crop or maybe it could be just a cover crop. And with what Rory and them give with incentives, you can afford to do some things.
I'll just add to that too. The NRCS considers a cover crop an additional crop for that crop rotation. And so we do have a practice 328 conservation crop rotation that we can provide a payment for. In addition to that cover itself, what we would encourage is a lot of guys will do barley after barley, especially in that Worland area. But to add diversity to that is what's important and what we would be encouraging. And that is going to therefore increase the diversity of your biology, your microbes in the ground. So that's the reason we like to mix that up. So that's what I wanted to add.
So could you plant a cover crop with the idea, yeah, I'm going to probably terminate it, but if the price of that seed is good, I might just keep it. I guess that wouldn't be qualified as a cover crop anymore, would it?
Yeah, so you cannot do that under NRCS cover crop. It has to be terminated, and we have to put that in the plan of how it's going to be terminated. And in most cases, it's frost. It's going to terminate the cover crops that we're planting.
I guess where I was coming with that was that winter wheat acres in Missouri have gone down, but winter wheat's a great cover crop, a great soil health builder. And some folks are saying, I'm going to plant it. And if the price of wheat goes up, I'm going to let it go and get a crop off it. But it sounds like you can't be in the NRCS program and do that. But you could on your own. Yeah. Because I think some of our farmers are missing the opportunities in cover crop seeds. There's a big demand for them. And maybe this is what you could look at and even export them. You mentioned y'all do alfalfa seed. Have you looked at the price of hairy vetch seed or common vetch seed? That's outrageous. And if y'all could grow seed, that may be a nice little income, and you could benefit your whole soil that way.
You're right on that, and we do have seed growers, in the basin, in the Heart Mountain area, grass seed. So that is a crop around here. And with the cover crop, we do encourage grazing. So not harvesting as a cash crop, but the grazing is highly encouraged, and we want to get that manure dropped out there and worked in over the winter as well. To address the question again, when we do conservation crop rotation, we are looking for other cash crops. So if we're just in a barley, beets, annual crops, maybe dry beans and corn, we're going to encourage some alfalfa in there or some perennial in there as well, just to give those microbes a chance to build populations with no tillage.
Okay, next question. Sunflowers are prone to severe wind erosion. Any association to your talk on aggregates?
Are they meaning what the sunflowers do for aggregates, or would aggregates help sunflower on wind erosion?
Yeah, that's how I understand it. Sunflowers are prone to severe wind erosion. So anything associated with your talk on aggregates, can those aggregates benefit or minimize that
Wind erosion
effect of wind
Definitely,
erosion
yes.
on something?
Yes, the larger aggregates are going to be a lot harder to pick up and move. So yes, that definitely will help.
All right. Yesterday you briefly mentioned biosol. Does it provide enough benefit to offset the cost?
Could that be thiosol, not biosol? THIO?
They type biosol, but it could be
Well, yeah.
thiosol.
Okay. So either I, misspoke and misheard. I'm not sure what biosol is, but thiosol is ammonium thiosulfate. Its advantage is you get nitrogen, you get sulfur out of it, and it actually acts as a soil conditioner also. So yeah, it's pretty popular in a high lime soil, but mostly because of the soil conditioning effect. Because of the greater price, you can't afford it for just the nitrogen and sulfur content. But in a high lime soil where we are putting nitrogen on mid-season on a pivot, it's pretty popular to mix a certain amount of thiosol in with the uran or 32 solution because of that soil conditioning effect, especially if you have high sodic fields, because it improves the water penetration. So I guess the answer is a strong maybe. And the more lime you have and the more sodium you have in the soil, the more likely the thiosol will be worth the extra price for it.
Okay, great. What about the organics fertilizer that some of the green folks promote for soil health, like fish fertilizer, worm-based, and etc.?
I became a believer on the worm castings, for example. And I think that's one of the questions was that, but I'll give you an example of that. As I said, for fun, we have a tomato fest and we grow 175 different varieties of tomatoes and just try to get people aware of what's out there. Well, a good friend of mine, she was growing tomatoes commercially. And I stopped by one day, and this was during the summer. We had a lot of humidity, lots of diseases. We were constantly fighting the diseases, and she didn't have any. I thought, what in the world? She planted them too close. She did everything wrong. She'll have all kinds of diseases. So I got down and crawled in there, and I can see a little bit, but she said, "Yeah, I put a bunch of worm castings on this." And that was kind of an aha moment for me. This is probably 13, 14 years ago, that she improved her soil health so much and her plant health so much that those tomato plants could face that challenge of this is a disease. I mean, I had the same diseases I had, but they could overcome them because that plant was healthy. And that was one of the things I started looking at. And it's true that a healthy plant can overcome a lot of these diseases. And a lot of times a diseased plant is because something else is out of whack. So my long answer to that is yes, they can, and because they bring so much to the plate, especially if they're improving that soil quality, but they're also bringing some a good healthy plant, and that's important.
Okay, our next question. Sandfoin roots go 3 to 4 feet deep. Do they go that deep to get water or nutrients?
And they're growing. So
I guess the answer is yes.
Yeah.
An important point to note though is that roots will not grow into dry soil. They need the liquid to grow into. So there's this idea that the root will grow through the dry soil to try to find water underneath, and it won't. If you've got a wetting front 18 inches down, the roots aren't going to go any deeper than 18 inches down. You will see more root mass where there is something that the plant needs. So if there's a layer where, say, nitrates are high because the soil nitrates are sitting on top of an impermeable layer, you'll see a flush of roots there where they're picking up more of the nitrogen. So they will explore in how they grow. And if there's something there they need, certain nutrients, for example, of that layer, you'll see a proliferation of root growth in that layer. But especially in irrigated agriculture, I've seen some cornfields example where you would expect corn roots to go many feet down. And the corn roots are 10 inches down or so, because that's the water layer. It's dry beneath that, and they don't go any deeper, which is a problem because now you're trying to fertilize that cornfield with just 10 inches of soil instead of 3 feet of it.
I think that was great, Paul. Can you speak to the nutrient absorption of the roots at the different levels? And I think you kind of covered that already, but maybe review it.
It varies by crop, obviously, but typically something like 70 to 90% of your nutrient uptake is in the top foot, and the remainder is in all the feet as you go deeper, which is why that top foot is so important for the soil testing. And it's not that there isn't any nutrients down deeper, it's just not as important to the plant because it's not where it gets most of it. That also being said, though, if you look at the fertility at the soil of different levels, it's much, much lower as you go deeper. It's not uncommon at all for there to be 3 times or more the amount of nutrients in the top foot than in the subsoil down below. So the top foot's the most important foot, but there is some deeper, I guess.
yeah, there is. But I showed you those plots that haven't had any potassium fertilizer since 1888. That's because we had a big bulge of potassium availability about 2.5, 3 feet down. And we saw those symptoms of potassium deficiency until it hit that. And but that bulge in those plots is a lot smaller now, but it will bring it up. It's not as low in the top of soil as you would think because it gets down to that subsoil, it brings some up and starts building that up just a little bit. When Paul was talking, I was thinking about a 2x2. If you put a 2x2 beside your row when you plant a fertilizer, that will proliferate some roots right there. Yeah. But I don't know if the roots are if the plant's nutritionally happy and the water is there, will they still go deeper just on their own or not?
I think they do some.
Some, but again, most of your biology is in that top 7 inches, most of your aeration's in that top 7 inches to a foot. So I think that's why they hang out so much there.
And kind of a personal experience talking about the depth of different nutrients. This was in a basin not far from where I live. Sugar beets and potatoes are in the rotation. The other crops are generally corn and wheat. And the issue with sugar beets is getting too much nitrogen late can reduce recoverable sugars. We don't want it. And one of the things that led to the amalgamated sugar in Idaho always sampling down 3 feet is a typical nitrate profile in this area might have 21 parts per million in the first foot, well, a little less than that. We'll call it 15 or 16 in the first foot, about 9 to 12 in the second foot, and 45 in the third foot, because there's a layer of clay there, and potatoes and corn, which are both pretty highly fertilized crops, are in the rotation. So when you do get some leaching, the nitrogen moves down and then sits on top of that clay layer. So then when you're looking at the sugar beet tissue tests, they'll start out where you want them to be. They'll be following desirable curve right where we'd like them to be. And then about at the 1st of August, which is exactly the wrong time, all of a sudden our tissue nitrate levels start climbing up because the roots finally get down to that layer with a high amount of nitrate in it. And then it causes some issues with low sugars at the end and high sugar beet nitrate levels. The fixing it's the problem because there's been attempts to, well, let's really starve them from nitrogen early And then that way, when they get to nitrogen late, it won't be the problem. The problem with that is you end up with a very limited sugar beet canopy, lower yields, and now you have low yields and bad sugar, which was not helpful. And so it's something to be aware of, that there can be these layers of fertility that really affect the plants. But this is fairly uncommon also. This isn't the normal for sugar beet growing. This is this one kind of odd area where the clay layer is at a certain point.
Okay, great. Our next question. Will brassicas interfere with sugar beet rotations? Question. Flax is mycorrhizal interference.
I've not had a lot of experience with brassicas in a sugar beet rotation, but I have seen it done. And to my knowledge, there's no interference because of that. I'm assuming this means a brassica grown as a cover crop prior to sugar beets would be my assumption. It is more common for us to actually plant barley, grow it up, and then spray the barley out with Roundup when it's about 2 inches tall to keep the sand from moving. Then you plant the sugar beets into that. That's more common, but I've seen that done with brassica and it seemed to work well.
But could brassica also mean like canola or rapeseed? And that's, that's a potential crop too in itself. But brassicas are non-mycorrhizal. Just remember that. Probably one season's not going to affect things a lot, but it could. I mean, there's just keep that in mind that you're going to not have any mycorrhizal infection. And what was the other thing?
Flax. Is it a mycorrhizal interference as well?
Oh, just like brassicas are. I don't believe so. I don't believe so.
Okay. We got a clarification. The biosol is a mix of raw sulfur mixed with compost. It's a post-consumer waste, and it's very common in Alberta. So I'm not familiar with it here.
Now, good. I am not familiar with it, nor by that term. I have seen the elemental sulfur mixed in with compost as a way to make it go on safely and easily. And I think it worked well. So assuming it's a similar type product, it seems like it would work fine. Biosolids are a euphemism for people manure. It's been sterilized people manure, and it's actually an extremely good source of fertilizer. It's not used on vegetables mostly because of the ick factor. But from a fertility standpoint, it works quite well. And so if we're dealing with a biosolid mixed with the sulfur, I think it'd be a very good fertilizer source.
So what happens if you put elemental sulfur in compost and let it sit for a while? Is that kickstarting that whole conversion, and you may actually get some benefit from that if you had the soil microorganisms there to
I don't know.
yeah, I mean,
So I don't know.
right. We were several years ago looking at trying to mix some rock phosphates and stuff with our compost during the composting process, thinking that might help kickstart some breakdowns. Anyway, work, but it was a thought.
Okay, that's all the questions I have in front of me here. We'll give it a little bit just so people have time to type their questions on the webinar and that. But anybody in the room, do you guys have any questions? I'll bring the microphone around.
So thinking about our need for sulfur and our need for nitrogen, product called ammonium sulfate, AMS, I have a tendency to use some of that. Can you specifically speak to its ability to volatilize compared to urea and sulfur separately? What does some of that look like?
Want to talk about that? You
Sure.
talk about that.
Yeah, ammonium sulfate's about 1.5 times as acid forming per unit of nitrogen as urea would be in that case. I can show you some really good evidence that ammonium sulfate doesn't volatilize nearly as bad as urea. And I can show you some really good evidence that ammonium sulfate volatilizes way worse than urea. It all depends on who does the research on it. And really the fundamental difference is how much water is applied, how quickly after application. In both cases, you don't get volatilization unless the fertilizer is in the top, call it inch of soil or so. It's got to be on the surface. And so if you water the urea down within the first 3 to 4 days after application, before it has a chance to convert to ammonium and volatilize, then you will see less volatilization than ammonium sulfate because it's down in the ground. If you leave both of them just on the surface without that, then you will see worse volatilization from urea just because of a reaction it makes with the carbonates. And in that case, the elemental sulfur with its greater acid forming reduces the amount of volatilization you get. So short answer to that, urea is better if you get water on, the right amount of water on within, say, 3 to 4 days. And urea is worse than ammonium sulfate after that.
So what about top dressing? And then coming through and cultivating, so I'm burying it.
If you're top dressing, then you're coming through and burying it, then you don't get volatilization with either one. So in that case, volatilization is just not a problem. And both products perform equally well from a volatilization standpoint, but ammonium sulfate gives you more acid forming action, but it costs more. So that's the balance to make, is the extra price of it versus the extra acid forming action you're getting worthwhile.
Paul, I've heard that ammonium sulfate though takes a little bit longer to become available for the plant than like urea would. And that would be maybe the release from the sulfur just takes longer.
Technically, all three are plant available forms of nitrogen: urea, ammonium, nitrate. Right. Immediately they'll go in, except that in practice, ammonium's not mobile and nitrate and urea are. So that first couple days after urea application, it can be taken up as urea. And then once it converts to ammonium, it tends to stay in the soil and not get to the plant until it then converts to nitrate and it moves with water to the plant. So it kind of yes, then no, then yes. And so depending on exactly how you plan your application and your timing in the water, you can get different answers on the experiment depending.
So back on the brassica comment or question, I can think of 2 sugar beet growers that are probably going to grow a hybrid canola seed crop this year, grow the canola 4 seed. And because I haven't talked to either one of them about this, but I'm wondering if they're wondering about what effects on their soil the canola seed crop might have in their, say, in their beet barley rotation. Maybe that's where that question came from.
You know, other than having them in non-mycorrhiza, I see no problems with it. I think I see that you added another species. You know, brassicas are different, and you're going to probably affect your soil microorganisms differently to the positive. So I wouldn't see an issue.
He typed in the chat or the chat box here that's in Alberta, the sugar beet growers are prohibited from having canola in the rotation, either beets or canola once every 4 years. So there's some restriction in Alberta, at least, that we're not aware of it apparently. So yeah.
You know, some brassicas are used for fumigants too. And I wonder if that could be part of it too. But you got to till it in. But one's called Pacific Gold even.
Yeah, his other comment was here is flax and corn are mycorrhizal crops and will have a negative yield response to brassica cover crops from the year previous.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I was if you grew, it seemed like the mycorrhiza is so resilient that it should come back. I would think, but maybe they know better. Maybe they've seen it. Maybe they've seen some data on that too.
Yep, sure. Other questions? Anything else? We're here for you guys, so this is your time.
I'll make a comment. Speaking of on a plant side of things, in nitrogen form, you know, plants need ammonium right about reproduction for about 1 to 2 week period. If you had to give them ammonium one time, if you hit it right before they go to flowering, it would pay. And because it changes the physiology of the roots and the plants just a little bit. And I always thought that was interesting. It actually changes the hormone balance of the plant. So if you can, when you talk about yes and no, if you could ever get that point where you got that flush of ammonia right there at, or ammonium right there at flowering, you would pay.
It used to be the preferred flown on dry nitrogen fertilizer for many of our crops was ammonium nitrate. Before it became a problem with being a hazardous material, first of all, there was less volatilization. You had less volatilization for ammonium nitrate than you do urea. The second is, I think, the effect that you're talking about. There was just this extra kick getting the ammonium on rather than the urea at just that right time. So I still actually have a client that pays the extra premium to get ammonium nitrate to put on, but quite pricey. You know, you'd better really want the extra, want it because of it.
That ammonium nitrate is such a wonderful fertilizer. But if you want the sweetest tomatoes, put some nitrate on your tomatoes. That's another thing I've learned.
He put a comment in here for the sugar beet comments. Sugar beet, webworm, and flea beetle are common problems and destroy your sugar beet stand. And so that's, I think, if I understand what he's saying here, is that's why they have that rotation restriction.
It's a host. The Nebraska is a host for those insects.
He doesn't say that, but I
Yes.
think that's what he's getting at. Yes. Other questions?
So more in terms of the lawn and garden versus the agronomic crops, for soil testing, how often would you want to do soil tests? Like before you plant? And then like, would you do it every year, a couple times a year?
In contrast to farmers, when I see a lawn and garden, it's almost always because there's a problem and they're trying to troubleshoot what the problem is. And so actual answer is, I think you ought to do it initially when you start the garden or the lawn area, so you know what kind of soil you're dealing with and get an idea of what it needs. After that, you probably don't need to do it again unless you have a problem, or maybe after several years to see how things are drifting elsewhere. But you really do need to have that baseline and what to start after. And then people generally use it as troubleshooting. And while I'm on that topic, troubleshooting thing that happens, number one, is way too much manure or compost. People put on 3 inches of compost, not realizing that that's, a 50-ton per acre application of compost. And problem number 2, there's this idea that carbon is always good. So they take 2 or 3 inches of soil mulch and they rototill that down. And soil mulch has a C to N ratio of like 200 to 1. And so what they end up doing is just sucking every little bit of available nitrogen out of their garden for the next several years. So those are problems number 1 and number 2 I see in gardens. So yeah, but the short answer is probably 1 to get yourself started and then troubleshoot after that, quite honestly.
And if you're using manure, make sure you find out what it was fed. I just talked to a person the other day who was buying horse manure. Horse manure is not that hot as far as too much nutrients. You're not going to burn your crops, but it had been fed hay that had been treated with some of the herbicides that carry over, and 3 years going, she still has issues. So I really want to make sure you know what you're getting and build a history on that. Also, I agree with what Paul was saying. I think most garden soil tests I've seen are super high in most everything, because you buy a bag of fertilizer and you put the whole bag on when I really only needed 10 pounds of this. And another question that we had, you know, the farmers, they're buying tons of stuff. It's easy for them to get lots of different types of products. But how about our home gardener? Are there some of these products? Can they find them locally?
It's hard. Yeah, yeah. The challenge almost boils into, how do you do that? You're not going to custom blend for 40 feet by 60 feet of exactly what you need. So what really seems to work the best is if you look at your recommendation on the soil test for how much nitrogen and phosphorus you need, try to find a blended fertilizer at the garden store that's pretty close to that. So, you know, if your recommendation per 1,000 square feet is 2, 3, 1, try to find something that has about the same ratio that then you can then put that blended fertilizer on. And then something like elemental sulfur will always be separate. You can add that on separately. But that is one of the bigger biggest complications with lawn and garden is you're not going to get that exact blend that the farmer is going to get in his circumstance.
As long as we're talking yard and garden. What I have 4 acres of virgin Wyoming untouched crappy land. Great land. What's the best? I don't really care what I plant, but you guys have talked about having something growing. What do I plant first? What's my first go-to? Yeah, I have water. I have all the water I want.
Assuming you got the good water, I think an initial compost and probably elemental sulfur if you have lime. And then probably what would be great here in Wyoming?
I
It
figured this
depends.
was a Rory question.
What are you trying to, what's your goal? What are
My
you trying
goal is to
achieve?
not have any other land that I own blow away to my neighbor's house. I just want something growing on it.
So what's currently,
Some sagebrush.
which is good. Sagebrush is some of your indicates good soil.
Okay.
So, I mean, the old timers knew that. And the tall basin big sage, that's where, if you're going to put effort into plowing with horses, that's what you're going to go to. And then Wyoming big sage. And it wasn't until, you know, the last 50 years where people were going into greasewood and some of those, you know, saltbush, you'll see that. So if it's really sagebrush out there, and have you noticed any of the grasses that you have?
We bought it in November, so I don't know.
Okay. So you'd go to Web Soil Survey and you find out what your soils are. You'd get a soils test and then you'd sit down to decide, is it just for aesthetics and keeping the soil on, or you plan to graze it, or, you know, what are your needs? If it's going to be a pasture, then there's a lot of options you could put out there as long as you have the water. But yeah, I mean, if you just want to hold it together, economically, your best option is weed and pest, because they offer seed that they've tried to come up with mixes that work well here. It's a great deal, and that's what I use actually. And they have a dryland mix, and they have a salt tolerant mix, and they have an irrigated mix.
That's just going to the weed and pest office.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, do a little planning ahead, like I said, and it's not going to work if you just broadcast it out there. Most likely, I mean, it'd be best if you could use a drop seeder. They have that as well. They can pull behind a 4-wheeler. It's made for 10 acres or less. There's a lot of options as long as you have water and you have good soils, which if you have sagebrush, they're decent soils.
What's weed pest?
It's county funded government organization to control weeds and pests in the county, and they're well funded, and Park County's got a great program.
And I would just add to that, don't get rid of the sagebrush, right? And if you want to hold soil, if that's your whole objective, grasses would be your best thing. And if you irrigate it and do the grass mixes like Rory was talking about, or other grass mixes, that would be the best thing to hold the soil in place and keep it. But in terms of how tall you want that vegetation and how you want to manage it, gets back to Roy's question, was like, what is the purpose, right? So because you could have some grasses like smooth brome that can get up 3-4 feet tall. Now you have a fire hazard and other things. So just go in with purpose, ask questions. You're doing a great job.
So could she go with pollinator mixes? Would that work? And I mean, because that's something that it's aesthetic. It gets the pollinators, the wildlife, and all that. But now, what does it take for a person like? Would she be qualified under your equip programs?
Yes, she would. Come into the NRCS and we'll go out and we will walk the site and I'll tell you what you have out there and then give you some recommendations. Extension can do the same. Weed and pest can do the same. It's pretty common around there. And yeah, we're glad when you ask. But yeah, there's potentially some assistance. Yep. And yeah, there's a lot of wrecks over the past where people have went in and said, hey, we got to fix this land. It's no good. Now we're going to make it better. And now you have cheatgrass and halogeton. So you got to be real careful. And those folks were trying it in a dryland situation. With water, you have a lot of options, but we would do a little on-site soils investigation and we'd talk to you about your goals. And that's what conservation planning is. And it doesn't matter if you have 4 acres or 400 acres, we'll help you.
And as you might find out, I got my fingers in way too many projects, but one is pollinators. And what we found out, if you build the habitat, they will come because there are remnant populations of everything out there. For example, bumblebees, we had like 2 or 3. When we built a habitat, we got 7 or 8 different species, ones that we thought that we didn't have, because there are remnant populations and they will find it.
Okay, while you guys are thinking, there's one here on, and we've talked about it several times, but where can I go to get our soil tested, and is it expensive? So where you can get a soil tested is there are soil labs in the area, right? Stukenholtz is one. We're real glad Paul was here to talk to us, but there's others. Ward Labs out of Nebraska, Midwest Labs. And I don't know where this person's located at, but those are the ones close to Wyoming. There's Colorado State University has a soil lab, and so does Utah. And so depending on what you're wanting to do, those are the soil labs in our vicinity. Talk to those labs, talk to them. The second follow-up to that question is it expensive for soil testing? Depends on your interpretation for how expensive. We had a conversation of this at lunch. They can start at $6 for a soil test all the way up to, I don't know, $100 or something like that. So depending on what you think is expensive, but in terms of what, at least from my perspective, what you're going to do with that soil test, it can be rather inexpensive, especially if you're a producer and it's a crop and you're trying to make money off of it, or a producer or a gardener trying to feed your family or something. It's relatively inexpensive in the grand scheme of things. But if you're not going to use the soil test, I don't see the value in it.
Now, speaking of soil test and the different cost, some of them, when they get your numbers, the computer will spit out the recommendations. Paul, do you all look at, other folks will look at each individual one and make considerations?
Yeah, the computer spits out the recommendation initially, and we've got extremely complex equations, much more than you usually would. But then I look at each one, and it's not uncommon that I will change something for that circumstance. And even more so, if it's an issue, give me a call. It's not uncommon also when we're talking on the phone to then change that recommendations as I get a better understanding of exactly what your situation is on that. I do find you can go into a rabbit hole of trying to have the computer customize everything. So for example, we were talking about nitrogen recommendations, flood switching to an irrigation. I do have it set up in the recommendations that you get a higher nitrogen recommendation if you're flood or furrow than if your wheel lines or pivot. I assume a lower nitrogen use efficiency if you're flood. So should I do that also between wheel line and pivot? Well, I probably should, but now I'm starting to get real complex, and I'm not sure what nozzles you have on your wheel line, or whether you do 12-hour sets or 8-hour sets, and you can get too far into this. So I've made one change there between gravity and all sprinklers, but I fully expect you to make more modifications as you have an idea of exactly how that irrigation system works, or exactly how that fertilizer is going to be put on. And some ways are simply more efficient than others. And I expect the recommendations to be changed based on that efficiency.
And I've noticed that as well, seeing soil tests over the years for the past 20 years, that it used to be the highest recommendation was generally from the lab. And then it was UW. And then, we were in there, and now it's UW is usually higher than the labs because UW's recommendations didn't change. And then nobody said, hey, maybe we should change this based on the irrigation efficiency. What are they using to apply? Anyway, I've noticed that and I always wondered. So thank you.
Sorry, Gary.
I had one from this morning on a manganese slide. I got stuck on the idea of organic matter decomposition and stabilization. And can you have both of them at the same time? Or what does manganese do in that?
I think it goes back to the soil, to the microorganisms. It's partially that, and as far as stabilization and keeping them going. But one thing you gotta remember about organic matter, it's not just a bank that you want to hoard either. That you want it to work for you. Right. You got to, you can build your organic matter at 5-6%, but is that doing you any good? So you want to make sure that you're actually turning that over. And when you think about stabilization, meaning that it's stable in that it's in this equilibrium where it's constantly turning over and rebuilding. And that's what we're talking about.
Add to it with something.
Right. You want to keep adding to it, but you don't want it just to go up like your bank account doesn't do.
What else? Okay, as you guys mull it over and think about it, Micah, would you mind bringing up our speaker gifts? We really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. We really, especially Paul and Dr. Reinbach, we came a long ways for us and we appreciate it. And you really worked us hard and we worked you hard and everything, but we really appreciate everybody, all of our speakers. We got a lot of compliments for Chris as well, and his presentation. We were talking about that last night at dinner and everything. So we were really grateful and appreciate your time and energy. So really appreciate that. Here's just a thank you and a token from us.
Well, we really appreciate you inviting us. This has been better than I even dreamed. It's been I've learned so much.
Good.
I really have.
That's what I've told everybody else. Everybody's like, oh, this has been so good. And I really appreciate it and good speakers and that. And I said, I think it's mutual. We talk just as much as speakers and presenters and UW and participants and everything. It's just been a great conference.
Personally, this is one of the best conferences I've been to. And for its size, I think it is the best conference I've been to. This has just been outstanding for both what I've learned as well as everything else. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Thank you.
Yeah. When you told me that it was going to be video and be able to access this, like I said, there's a lot of applicability to our employees. And what I was able to take home, they're not able to be here, but I definitely want to play that for. I want them to take this as part of one of their trainings, to maintain their certification.
Sweet.
So,
awesome.
Very appreciated.
Awesome. What else, guys? Last questions.
More question for you.
For me?
What kind of?
I'm not on the spot. You can't do that.
As I've been looking at the slides, sometimes the pictures were really condensed and I can't read the numbers or the words specifically. Will we be able to get a better quality of the slides?
So the video, we'll provide the video. You have the handouts in the book. If it's okay with our presenters, I can share PDF versions of the PowerPoints and they won't. So yeah, they're way condensed, right? We had to put I think it was 9 slides on a page and that got us to 122. And so if I did 1 slide per page or 3, I mean, we couldn't have printed this, right? It got huge, which is great, but I'm more than willing to share it as a PDF and it would be a single slide, right? As long as our presenters are good with it.
And my email's not in the book, I noticed. So could you share it if they want to shoot me an email? It's Reinbach T, 3 T's at the end at Missouri.edu. If you want to shoot me a message, if you want something or
Yep.
'Cause I had a few or something like that.
Yeah, I'll send that out with our, with the email with those PDFs, but yes, I can share that. That wouldn't be a problem. Yep.
I've got kind of a closing question for each of you, if you don't mind speaking to this a little bit. Thank you for the excellent information you shared over the last couple of days. In the interest of learning being kind of a lifelong process, what's something new that you learned over the presentations we saw the last couple of days, or what would be the biggest takeaway that you want folks to go home with?
Because I'll have it. You know, I was coming in, I talked to Jeremiah about irrigated agriculture, but so I was really worried about what we can do to flush the nutrients out. Do we have enough rainfall? And I was so impressed with how you already had this figured out about how you can control your irrigation to for your crops, but also how to flush it out and get rid of the excess sodium and the other things. I was just so impressed with that and how you got it down to a science. And then the tiling yesterday, that really opened my eyes up. Yeah, I think in a dry land area, you're tiling, and then of course with Paul's explanation about in soil physics about how all that works, I thought that just fit in so wonderful.
So just making these connections is very beneficial. So I know I can email or call and ask some additional follow-up questions. But when I first showed up yesterday, the talk that you were giving and just going back to the basics of definitions of those of a lot of the confusing terms is very beneficial. And the fact that I have the handbook to look at, you know, on that, for me, that was very helpful. And I think the video, you know, I wasn't able to attend the whole thing, but I'll be able to catch up on some of that. I'm sure I'll have a lot more questions. I just learned that I don't know much.
Right.
There's
right.
just a lot of information,
lot.
and I'm glad that there's folks out there that get to really look into that. So resources. So.
Yeah, I think it's all been really good. As far as lifetime learning goes, man, agriculture, there is always stuff you don't know in agriculture. My dad would say the same thing. He did his entire life and he was still discovering brand new things that he didn't know before. And so that is absolutely the truth. If I had to pin it down to one thing, I think it was the practical demonstration of how to tile fields yesterday that I will probably carry the most out of this with. Although, like I said, it's hard to say. There's been a lot of really good stuff, but some of the practicalities of how deep, how big around, what spacing, and this type of thing into the tiling, I think will be very useful. But yes, it's been great.
Great. That's it. We're gonna cut it off there. Give these guys a break up here. Really appreciate everybody.